Cool, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in today since we have a lot to cover. So in today's session, I was going to go over the GitHub API. However, I think it will be best to start with JavaScript and jQuery. And if you don't have any experience with JavaScript, I do suggest that you go through this Mad Libs tutorial. I'll send out a link at the end of this session, which basically provides a crash course in JavaScript and jQuery. And you can actually access that from the free resources page on realpython.com. So real quick, a common question that people generally have is what's the difference between JavaScript and jQuery? And the answer is simple. So jQuery is JavaScript. It's a library built with JavaScript, making it easier for developers to write JavaScript code that manipulates the DOM. And we'll talk about what that term means, the DOM, in just a minute. So we're going to be covering a lot today, and you're probably going to see new technology and deal with some technologies that you may have never seen before. It's a lot to take in, and it may not click right away. So like the other sessions, a recording will be made available, and you can always supplement this video with the second Real Python course, where I touch on JavaScript in greater detail. So let me get my screen shared. Okay, so let's go ahead and start by activating the virtual environment. And let me go ahead and zoom in here. I actually forgot to do that last time. Okay, hopefully you guys can all see that. Okay, so let's start by just firing up the server and running the app just to see what we have going on right now. So cd into your app directory, and then you can just run python app.py. So we can enter two numbers here, so 2 and 2, and submit them, and we get an answer there. So basically right now our app just takes two values and adds them together. And if we go back to our server here, go ahead and kill the server. And you can, on a Mac, it's Control-C. And let's open up the code real quick and see what we have, just as a review. And let's pay specific attention to this home view function. So right now we're handling the form submission by grabbing the values right here from the form, and then actually from the post request, and then adding them together right here, and then we render a new template, and then we pass the sum to that template to be rendered using a Jinja2 template tag, and you can see that template tag here. So again, we are passing in this value here, and it is getting rendered right here with this template tag. And this is actually not the most efficient way of handling this, so we're going to be taking a look at another way. So first, instead of rendering a template here, let's actually return the value as a JSON object. And Flask has a really cool method for this called JSONify. So let's start by adding the import up here. JSONify. Now we can refactor the view function just a little bit. So we can say data equals total colon string, and then we'll pass in the total here. And then instead of rendering a template, let's return this using JSONify, and we'll pass in data to that. So basically we're creating a Python dictionary with a key of total and a value that includes the actual total, and then we're serializing it into JSON and then returning it. So let's just test this out real quick. So if we run our app here, so if we do 2 and 2 again, hit submit, you can see here is the JSON response. So if you open up the Chrome Developer Tools, and you can do that with, there's a number of different ways to do that. You can do View, Developer, and then Developer Tools, and then click the Network tab here. Let's try submitting that again. So here's the request. If we click on that, we can scroll down and then we can see the response here. And you can see that the content type or the MIME type is JSON. And so Flask automatically assigned that MIME type to that response for us. And that's all happening with this JSONify method. So it's really cool. Okay, so moving on, we of course do not want that end user to just see a response in JSON. So instead, we want to grab that response and add it to the DOM. So if you've never heard that term before, DOM, be sure to Google it, as it's important to know. And obviously do that after the session. But it's basically the rendered form of HTML and JavaScript. It's what you see when you view a web page in the browser. But we can manipulate the DOM with JavaScript and jQuery. So let's look at how to do that. So first we want to create a JavaScript file. And let's go ahead and add a new folder to our main app directory called static. Okay, so we need to create that directory, so we can just do make directory static. And so by default, all static files, like say images, style sheets, and JavaScript files should be placed in this folder. So in that folder, let's put a file called main.js. So enter that folder, and then touch main.js. And let's go ahead and open our index.html templates. So we need to add that main.js as an import into this template. So let me just copy this, paste this here. We can say source, and then URL for, we'll pass in that directory. We also need a file name. I believe this is the right syntax. I guess we'll find out in just a second. Oops. And then the closing braces there. So URL4 is a method provided by Flask that's used to build a URL. And so by passing in the static endpoint and a file name, it'll render a URL for that file name in the static directory. So it's really just pointing to the static directory and then grabbing that main.js file. And that'll get loaded into the index.html file when it's rendered in the by the browser. And you also be sure to place that URL, this URL here, below the jQuery import here. So the browser loads these files in order, and since we're going to be using jQuery in our main.js file, we actually need to load jQuery first. So let's open this main.js file, and we're just going to start with some basic code here. So let me just type this out, and I'll explain what's happening after I'm done. So we'll just do $, and then documents, ready, put an anonymous function here, open curly brace, and we'll do a console.log, to log the text ready. Okay. So real quick, so this document.ready is an event that we're listening for. And this event is triggered when the DOM has fully loaded. And so that's when the page has fully loaded in the browser. So after that page loads, all code is ran within this anonymous function. So in this case, we have a console.log that logs the text ready to our JavaScript console. So put another way, we're logging the text ready to the JavaScript console after the DOM is fully loaded. And two more things. It's convention to use this document ready and place all JavaScript and jQuery code within this function, so just do it. And the $sign here is actually a shorthand for jQuery. So let's test this out. Let me make sure, actually, yeah, I do need to fire back up my server. So let me back out here. So Python app.py. Okay. So we got an error here, a syntax error. So that's with file name. Let's see what's going on here. Forgot a comma. Little things like that. Okay. That should be working now. Cool. So now let's go ahead and open up our JavaScript console. So view, developer, Java console, and we can see the text ready. So now with jQuery set up and working, let's go ahead and add some code to grab the values from that form. So again, I'm going to go ahead and code this out real quick, and I'll kind of explain what's going on along the way, but I will offer a more detailed explanation at the end. So $, and form, and we're going to listen for a form submission. And then we're going to console log form has been submitted. Okay. Be the closing param there, and then a semicolon. And so here we're watching for an event, a form submission, and when that happens, we log to the console this text here: the form has been submitted, yay. And so before we can test this out, we also need to prevent the default browser behavior on a form submission, which is to submit the form and send the data from that input box to the back end or to the server side. And so why do we need to do that? Because we're going to be handling everything within this JavaScript file. I guess we could say that we're hijacking the default browser behavior and doing everything in the JavaScript file. That's really the point of what we're doing here. And so to prevent the default browser behavior, one way to do that is if we go to our index.html file, on this form tag, put an attribute here on submit, we can do return false. Okay, so back in our browser here, let's go ahead and try to submit this form. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is exactly what we wanted to happen, really nothing. So we don't want the browser handling the request since it's going to happen in that JavaScript file. And you can see that the form has been submitted. So we are, in fact, listening for the form submission, and then within our JavaScript file, when the form is submitted, we are logging this console log. Okay, so let's take this one step further, and let's go ahead and grab the values from that form within our JavaScript file. Let me just create a variable called value1 and $ input name equals number 1. We actually need to do this here. Okay. All right. So if we go back to our markup here, and we take a look at this input tag, we have the name here of number 1, and so that's what we're targeting here. So we're targeting the input box that has a name attribute of number 1, and then we're grabbing the value of that, and then we're assigning that to this variable here. So now we also need to grab the second number, so let's call this value 2, and this is going to be number 2. And again, let's just go ahead and console.log it, just to make sure that everything is working fine. And then we'll log these variables here. Okay, there we go. So 6 and 7. Hop back here. All right, so now we have the values. So now we need to take those values and pass them to the server side, which is represented by our app.py file. And so to do that, we're going to use a client-side technology called Ajax. So let me go ahead and code this real quick. So we're sending a post request to the backend for the server side to this main URL and then passing this data. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and assume that this is working for now. And so now let's turn to the server side and let's figure out how to process this within our app.py file. It's actually super simple. let me add a method here, .get. And this is going to be first. This will be second. Form.get is used to access the data from a post request. And since we're grabbing the keys here, it's actually going to assign the value, which is the value from the inputs, to these variables. Then again, we're just adding them together and then passing them to this dictionary here and then returning it as JSON. So that's it for app.py. We don't need to really change very much. So again, we're grabbing the values, we're summing them, and then we're turning it as a JSON object. So going back to the client side here, we need to handle the response that's coming back. And we're going to be doing that using success and error functions here. If we get a successful response, it's handled here, and a successful response is just a 200 response, then we're going to console log the data that is sent back. And then if it's an error, if it's like a 400 level or a 500 level response, then it's going to be handled with this error handler here, and then we're console logging the entire error. Okay, let's go ahead and test this out. Try this again, 2 and 3. Okay, there we go. So there is the object here. Key is total, and the value is 5. So again, we're passing this object back right here. We're handling that response, the successful response here. We're just grabbing it and then log into the console. So what happens if there is an error? We can actually test that out real quick. So JSONify by default is sending back a 200 response here. But let's just send a 500 error back. So let's just say 500. This is going to just simply override Flask default behavior of sending a 200 response. And this will force an error. So let's just test this out. So if I say 2 and 5, submit it, you can see that we get this 500 response. And here's the actual error object. You would want to actually parse this within the JavaScript file and then grab probably maybe the response. You want to grab something from this and render it to the DOM so the user is not seeing nothing. The user is not, most end users are not going to open up the JavaScript console to see if anything's getting logged to the console. So something needs to be actually appended to the DOM. Otherwise, all the user is going to see is, hey, I want to add together 2 and 6, submit it, nothing comes back, it's broken, never going to use this thing again. So we actually need to add something to the DOM, so some sort of error. And let me show you how to append stuff to the DOM, but first, let's just go ahead and remove this here. So we want to actually just add that value to the DOM, so the value is just the sum of the 2 inputs. So going back to our markup here, let's put in a break here, and then just move the Jinja templating here. Let's do a span, say ID equals results, the closing tag there. Okay. So back in our JavaScript file, we just say $, and then pound. That ID is called results. So we'll say .html, and let's do not type, results not total. Okay, so what is this doing? So we are targeting that tag, which is this here. And again, we're using a CSS ID selector. And then we're using the HTML method to add text to the DOM. And the text is the value of the total key. So we're sending back this object here which has a key and a value. The key is total, value is the sum. So if we call results.total, it's going to return the value. Okay, so let's test this out again. We refresh this. Let's do 10 and 20. Go and submit it. Perfect. Let's see what's going on in our console. Let's try 2 and 4, 6. Cool. All right, so finally, let's go ahead and empty the input boxes after a success, so that the user can easily enter new values to add together. So let me show you what that's going to look like. So we're just going to target an input tag. All we're going to do is set the value, nothing. So again, let's test this out. So I wrote 5 and 5, 10, and you can see here it removed the values here. So now the user can easily just enter numbers here. All right, perfect. Okay, so going back here, let's go ahead and kill the server. And we now need to commit our code. So git add -a. Oops. There we go. Now we can do git commit, and for a commit message, let's just say added jQuery and Ajax. And so after you're done, you can go ahead and deactivate. Okay, cool. Well, that is it. I know that we covered a lot here, so let me try and summarize this. So we started by updating our home view function to return JSON on a post request. And then we set up JavaScript and jQuery on the client side, grabbed the values from the form using jQuery. Then we sent those values to the server side using Ajax. And then on the server side, we were doing pretty much the same thing we were doing last time. We were just taking the values, summing them, then we're returning them. And those get returned to the client side as a JSON object. And then we took that JSON object, we parsed it by grabbing the value associated with the key, and then we added that value to the DOM. And that gets added between the span tags here. Cool, so I hope that is all clear. And again, I strongly advise that you go through this Mad Libs tutorial. So you can access the Mad Libs tutorial by going to More, Resources, and here's the Mad Lib tutorial here. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me at info@realpython.com. If you're watching live, you can post them in the chat area, which I will look at in just a second. So if you don't have any questions, thanks for watching, and I will see you next week where we are going to finally begin working with the GitHub API.